We want to thank our sponsors and our partners, the Dixie L. Leavitt School of Business, the Utah Rural Summit, and Wells Fargo. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. So without any further ado, Melissa Garland is the kind of sales leader whose business experience is primarily in the shoes of her customers. For most of her career, Melissa has worked as a global marketing strategist for companies such as Adobe and Samsung. And from the agency side for clients, including Best Buy, Iron Mountain, and L'Oreal. She is currently Vice President of Client Development at AtlasRTX. So with that, we want to welcome Melissa.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott. It's really tough. Like there's never applause, you know, like there's no sound in this world that we live in. And it's hard to be there you go. Thank you. It's hard to be a presenter in this world where you get no feedback. But I'm very pleased to be here and honored to have been invited to share with you what I know and what I love the reactions. That's awesome on the screen. And, you know, I have had a lot of good experience in the world of marketing and now sales, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the things that I've found useful. Quite honestly, no one has worked with every possible platform out there, so I'm not going to be able to give you insider information on every possible thing you could consider, but I will give you some high-level views on what's worked. And I am very, very open to questions along the way. I want to make this as useful and interactive, well, as useful for you guys as possible, and happy to respond as we go. And I think I need to share my screen first and foremost. So let me get that going. And for some reason, it's not giving me that green bar around my screen that says I'm sharing. Is anybody able to see this or no? Yes, thumbs up. All right, that's good to hear. Okay, great. So we're going to talk about team tools. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how I think about categorizing the tools that are available to you and what those categories of tools can do for you. And then the value that they can bring and when and if and how you should consider them in your business. So let me start. There we go. With just a few seconds about me. You heard my bio, which is the one that's on the website of the company that I work for now, which is called AtlasRTX. But I actually have two jobs. I think this was mentioned in our openings last couple of weeks ago. But my day job is as the VP of Client Development for a tech company that does chatbot technology. So we are selling, frankly, actually to a lot of education institutions, as well as visitor centers who are, believe it or not, they're actually tourism centers that are needing chatbot technology to manage visitors right now, as well as home building. One of the biggest industries that we've been involved in is with home builders. And so my experience across different industries there has given me some insights that I hope to be able to share. And actually in that AtlasRTX experience, I have been a remote employee from day one. My first day on the job was March 16th, which was the day that everybody shut down. So I have never stepped foot in an office. A number of my colleagues I have never met face to face, which is really funny in a company of 23. But it's been really fascinating to see how we are managing remote work in that environment. And then my other job is as the owner of a couple of yoga studios, one in Lehigh, one in Park City. I only have one employee there, but I have 40 contractors that I am constantly having to keep up to date. And so there are tools that we, as we went to shutdown mode in the world of yoga, how do you begin to communicate about that, both to clients and within the employees and contractors that work with us. So that's where I come from. Let me get this back. And I wanted to start with probably something that's quite obvious to all of you, which is that, you know, this question of what tools and remote and digital tools to use is critical for obvious reasons. We're not going back, right? We are not going to be stepping, people talk about the new normal, that hated phrase. But it's pretty clear that if you're not adapting to new technologies of communication, particularly remote communication, then you're just going to get left behind. And it's really been quite interesting personally for me, in the world of my day job, working as the VP of client development for a company that does a lot of work with home builders. So in the world of home building, if any of you have ever bought a home or have worked for a home builder ever, it's not an industry that's known as being very tech forward, right? So they're like the last ones to adopt some of these technologies. And yet, and many of them did have these kind of 2-year plans for how they were going to adopt and adapt in the world of online home buying. And then the coronavirus hit, and a 2-year plan became a 2-week plan. And suddenly these businesses had to figure out how to ramp up quickly to offer solutions that could facilitate customer engagement, right? So that's what everybody's facing. And no one thinks we're going to go back to the old way of doing things when it's all said and done. So the way to think about the categories of technology, and there are a lot of different ways to think about it, but there are 3 we're going to talk about and 4 others that you could think about for your business. But we could talk about communication technologies, right? Ones that allow us to do what we're doing right now. Collaboration, which you can think of as project management technology. And then, of course, file management, content management, file sharing, right? And we're going to focus on those 3 today. But there are other categories that are certainly interesting and maybe relevant for your businesses: time tracking, design tools, online documentation, and software development. And these situations, well, time tracking is obvious, design's fairly obvious as well. Online documentation is where you're doing things like, instead of using your Microsoft 365 desktop-based tools of Excel and Word, you're actually using Google Sheets and Google Docs, right, in place of those online in place of the desktop-based tool management. And then software development are obviously tools that allow specifically software developers to engage and communicate and connect in the back-end development or work that they're doing. But we're not going to focus on those today. We're going to stay focused on the top 3. So here's how I'm going to take a look at them. I wanted to talk a little bit about the capabilities of each category, what they can do for you. And again, none of this is rocket science. You guys are all going to be familiar with it. I'll just give you my perspective on what's worked and some options that you might want to consider if you haven't done so already. And then I've done something that I've called a criticality scale on a 0 to 10, which is, 0 being you can do without it, and 10 being that it's a must-have. And then I'll show you a little bit about the available tools in that given category. And again, none of this is exhaustive. I've tried to give as comprehensive a list as I can find, but every day there are new tools and new options that are coming out, which may be worth exploring. So, and then finally, pricing scale, which again, I've done some preliminary research here. Some of these things have free tools. So the $0 one is the free tool version, which sometimes is completely sufficient, especially for small businesses. Then there's the step up to that where some minimal investment will be necessary to even get any access to the use of the tool. And then my $3 version where more investment is either necessary to really get value or to make use of the product over time, particularly as you grow, right, as a company. So I'll give you my best shot at some of that. And you'll be able to go look up a lot of these businesses afterward and do your own due diligence to go deep. So again, throw up any questions as we go. If there's anything you want to hear about in particular, I'm happy to try to answer it. But let's start with communication. The most obvious and critical component to these tools or being digital, being remote, is the ability to connect, right, with your staff, with your colleagues. And it's quite obvious how they work. What's interesting about them is that they have varying degrees of functionality and capability. I think you've already heard a lot about Zoom and Slack and Asana and how those work. There are quite a few others out there. And in fact, the communication category is probably the largest category of tools available. And that's where it gets confusing and frustrating. Like, which of these do I really need? And which of these do I, can I not live without? And I would argue from a criticality perspective, this is where it becomes very business specific, right? For example, with my yoga studio, last night we have turned to Zoom calls to meet as a team, but we don't really need it. And the only reason we're doing it is because we're already paying for the Zoom channel to run classes. If we weren't doing that, we'd still meet by phone. We just use, for small teams, phone communication works just fine. And particularly now that in your, iPhones, you can do FaceTime and see people, which I find is actually one of the most beneficial things of the remote communication tools, right? For years, I worked at Adobe with team members who were around the globe, and we had the tools for video conferencing, and people just refused to participate. They just wouldn't turn their video on. And it makes a huge difference, right? In how you see like somebody's response, their facial expressions, just a sense of connection with who they are. So I highly recommend video communication, but I would say if you're a very small business and you don't have to have it, you could certainly do without it. But I put it at close to the 9 to the 10 on the criticality scale for the reasons that I've just mentioned. Now, some of these tools will work in ways that engage with other steps in the process, whether in the case of, for example, Microsoft Teams, which has seen a huge surge in this time of coronavirus. Teams provides not just the video conferencing with your staff and your teams, but also chat and document sharing, all in the same platform. So sometimes these things will cross into other areas, and so you can get multiple benefits in one, whereas of course Zoom or GoToMeeting, they allow for some of this sharing, but not in the same kind of internal exchange kind of way, right? So here then are a couple of pages of the communications tools that are out there for you to consider. Some of them are more designed for large groups, like Yammer is a subset of the Microsoft 365 tool set, really designed for large town hall events, 10,000 or more people. And then each of these things have different levels of engagement, right? Often there's per user pricing at the communication tool level, or a group of users that are allowed to engage with it. So from Microsoft Teams is one that I have only started to use myself in the last few months. I mentioned it already. It's a great system. What you start to find challenging is that if you're tracking your calendar over here and your Teams engagement over there, sometimes things get conflated and confused. So there are things around trying to narrow yourself down to one system that can really be helpful. Finding the system that for the best price gives you the access to multiple tools is definitely something I think about as a small business owner, right? Zoom is quite obvious, and as I mentioned already, in the yoga world, we immediately had to go to classes online in order to stay open as a business. We have to pay a monthly fee, the highest monthly fee, in order to enable that to happen, which is challenging for a small business budget. But it has done some interesting things for us. Just as a side note, my business in the world of yoga is about one of the things that we've learned in the world of fitness is that it's not just about getting in and getting the physical practice, it's also about connecting people, right? And what people have really enjoyed with the Zoom classes that we've done is that 60 people will log on a Sunday morning for a 9 a.m. class, and we unmute everybody, and everybody says hi, and and the teacher always makes sure to point out and say hi to folks and reconnect. And then at the end of the class, they do the same, unmute everybody, everybody says goodbye. And that has really been very valuable for a lot of people in this environment. Now, that may be something that is relevant for a business like yours, to engage customers in a way that makes them feel connected, you know? So the other important point, obviously, is that these things tend to be more beneficial for customer-facing activities, and some of them are more beneficial for internal team-based activities. So Microsoft Teams is very clearly an internal product, although you can use it to talk to others who are on the same platform. Zoom is really great for external. Slack, internal. GoToMeeting, external, right? So those are ways to think about which of these to use. Google Hangouts has been used a lot by schools. It's a really low-cost way to engage. I don't use it much, so don't know how well it works, but it does give you the access to video and voice calls. Workplace by Facebook is also something I've just learned about, but don't have much experience with. But again, video and chat, I think it's Facebook's attempt to try to get into the workspace, the business side of things. And then you run into these tools like Gel, which are part communication, part project management. We'll see a bit of that as we move into the next category. The latest one that I just came across was this idea called Twist. I haven't spent any time with it, but it is seen as the new lower cost alternative to Slack and Teams. So an internally facing product that might be something worth exploring. And it does seem to have some useful features at the zero price level. So something worth looking at. And then here's the rest of the list that I've come across, none of which have I used, or frankly, I hadn't even heard of some of them. So it just shows you how many players there are in this space. And it kind of just depends on how much time you want to spend digging into each and every one of them, right? So any questions about communication? I guess, Madeline, you'll jump in if you have any questions for me, right?
I do have a question from Ruben Vasquez. He says, what communication tool do you like best? Zoom, GoToMeeting, etc. What are some of your favorites?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's been fascinating to watch the Zoom, if you will, controversy, right? And the challenges that they faced from a security perspective. So I've heard some horror stories about passwords being stolen and like entire groups on Zoom being held hostage to pay up or get their passwords released to the universe, right? So that's scary. And I'm about to badmouth Zoom. And as a small business owner where we were using Zoom, and even in my day-to-day now, it seems like it's just so many people using it that they get hit with bandwidth issues, right? When it works great. And we probably find that 2 times out of 20, we have trouble, right? A lot of trouble. So that's always frustrating. And it's frustrating for every tech company to be a victim to what happens with bandwidth and internet access and so forth. Same true in my business where tech goes down, it's not our fault. So, but I personally am starting to look toward less used tools. And I realize actually there's one that I left off here that is actually fairly big, but it's generally sold at the more enterprise level. It's called Blue Jeans. Another one to look at, similar to GoToMeeting and Zoom. It's a cute name, but it's basically a video conferencing technology. I haven't had a ton of experience with it. Adobe uses it now, and it seems to work really well for them. And I don't know what its pricing is at the smaller company level. So my tip there is consider some of the tier 2, the step down video conferencing tools, if only to avoid both the security issues and the bandwidth issues, and see if you can find one that works for you. Okay, so let's go to the second group of tools, which we've called collaboration tools, because it's important to have alliteration with communication collaboration, right? Otherwise known as project management, generally tools, right? So what do these do? Well, they obviously enable you to track projects as you're working on them. And this has been a space that has really exploded in the last, I don't know, 10 years, but maybe even fewer, but it started in the you know, back in the creation and development and the phases of creating and building products and creating and building software in particular, and needing now, as we've gone to more and more content creation for, say, websites, right, and marketing purposes, you need a tool to say, what's the stage of this project? Who's touched it last? Has it been approved? Has it received all the pieces it needs? Has it gone through the various reviews that are required, right? So that tends to be really important for larger organizations, but it can be really useful when you are delivering any kind of project, like, or product, particularly one that's a consulting type product to a client, right? So obviously I don't need this for yoga, but as we deliver products for the chatbot company, we are making sure that we're hitting all the milestones, right? And it allows the management to quickly step in and see where the product or project stands. And it uses various versions of project management and visualization. So if you're familiar with Gantt charts or the Kanban system, those are ways of looking at and chunking out projects and seeing where they are in the process. They're really great for reporting and enabling you to sort of quickly see where things are, and for reporting out to clients, right? So from a criticality perspective, I would put it on, you know, frankly, very business dependent. It very much depends on the nature of your company. But even within, again, even within my own little world of yoga, there are a whole bunch of things we're working on for the studio, which I lose track of all the time, right? So currently you use a spreadsheet, you put them all in there and you try to make it happen. But some of these versions of these tools have free versions for small teams that can make that super easy. You know, anything you're trying to track with your teams, yeah? So not as many tools in this category, but here are some that are kind of rising to the surface. You've heard about Asana. Basecamp is one that's pretty cool, that manages everything in projects, and it includes the discussions, the documents, the files, and the tasks. And that's sort of the big distinction between these different versions of these products, is that some of them have more or less in terms of what's attached onto the capability of and functionality of the project, right? Product. So sometimes they have document sharing, sometimes they have task management, sometimes they have internal communication components, sometimes they have the data visualization components. So it all kind of depends on what you feel you need with your business. Monday.com is one that has really impressed me in terms of the way they make it simple to stack blocks of, they break the project down into blocks, and then you automate the flow of the project. So as you are doing repeated tasks and repeated projects, if you're constantly creating new content for a client or for your website, or even the process of, potentially managing, you know, inventory and things like that. I shouldn't speak to that too specifically. There are probably other inventory management tools, but ways to automate workflows so that you know when something finishes stage 1 and moves to stage 2, that can be very, very helpful. And again, a lot of these have good functionality at the free level. And then when you really want to get into higher level reporting is when the price goes up. And often we don't need that for small and medium-sized businesses. It's only at the big enterprise level that you need significant reporting capabilities. So Basecamp, Monday, Asana, Podio, Trello, ProofHub, Liquid Planner, Rike. And then there are others that are out there, Workflow, Gantt Pro. Just it's the exercise I find as a business owner is the challenge, and how do I sift through all this? And even in this exercise that I did, it's still not easy to narrow it down. So probably my recommendation there is to sort of take a step back, think about the repeated tasks that are happening in your business, whether they focus on client delivery and service, or whether it's internal and necessary to manage it, your teams. Make those identifications, which then allow you to turn and look at these tools to choose the ones that are most valuable for you. Any questions on that? Okay. So let's go to the last category, which I've called content management, and is really about categorizing your documents, sharing them, retrieving them, right? And again, you'll all be quite familiar with these, storing, sharing, managing, collaborating across documents. Some of them are more focused on just the storage, some are more focused on the sharing, some are more focused on the management, some have collaboration tools within them, some don't. And in my opinion, though, this one, some version of this is an absolute 10 on the criticality scale. Like, this seems to be the biggest challenge for most of us, is especially if you are, you know, I went from owning one yoga studio to owning two and having multiple managers and people who needed to connect with the content that we use. And very quickly it became apparent that my computer was not the best place to keep everything that we were doing. So, you know, that from a never mind the fact that computers these days, like, you don't, it's so expensive to put all this storage capacity on your own desktop, right? Better to get it all in the cloud and then everybody can access it. Now, for this functionality, for this set of tools, to me, the number one exercise here is the time spent up front to ensure that you have naming conventions that make sense, file and folder structures that are logical and that are named in a way that are clear, right? As well as permissions, access permissions for folders based on team members and their responsibilities. So those three things, file naming conventions, folder structures, and user permissions, are things you're going to want to spend some time with up front. And the time you spend up front totally pays off in spades as you start to bring more of your staff on board into working with tools like this. For example, again, joining this small tech company, I have 3 staff who report to me, and they each manage their own section of the company file structure. And within the first, you know, month, I'm saying, so where is this and where is that and where's the other? Well, half of them are keeping the stuff on their desktop. And then when I go, and when they say it's in, we use SharePoint. So when they say it's in SharePoint, I go and I look, it's in no logical, like, giant folders with nothing in them, or sorry, there'll be folders with nothing in them, and then there'll be all these files that have no folders. The anal retentive person in me likes to have a folder for everything and everything in its folder, right? So once you get really clear on the way to structure things based on how you access them, based on what you need to use and how you want to, well, how you run your business, really. I literally spent like 3 hours on a Saturday just moving everybody's folders and files around and renaming them all. And I just went back to the team and I said, for the first 2 days, you're not going to be able to remember where you won't find anything because I moved it all around. But hopefully the file structure that I set up makes sense, and it has enabled them to know where to put things, to get them more clearly in the right place so that we can access them and use them all as a team, right? So it's all very obvious. It's a bit of a lecture, but it's interesting to me how often that doesn't happen. How often I walk into a big company, like when I went to work for Adobe, same story, walk into a big company and there are people with all kinds of crazy file names. You don't know the date, you don't know when it was updated, you don't know whether it was the final version or round 2 or round 6 or whatever, right? And no means of knowing which ones are the most useful, which ones are the ones we're using now. So it's critical that you undertake that exercise up front. And some of the tools you can use, Google Drive, SharePoint, very obvious. I've used those in both. I use them both now. Interestingly, personally, I found SharePoint more difficult to work with than Google Drive. If you happen to be a Google fan or a Microsoft fan or not, I apologize. but that's just been my experience. It's just easier to move things around. And both of these, all of these actually, pro tip here is they all have a client that you download to your own desktop so that it replicates the file structure that you have in the cloud on your computer, so that and you can end up working within the same file structure on your own, like Finder window if you use a Mac, move files around, and then it syncs back to the cloud storage version and everything is kept up to date. I've found that to be the most convenient way to work with my documentation. Dropbox for Business, Box for Business, you've probably heard of. Again, some of them are more targeted at enterprise level solutions, so the price goes up pretty quickly. And then there are some that are really just focused on sending large files. OpenText is one of those. MediaFire is sharing and collaborating, but big on multiple uploads and downloads in terms of large files. So another thing to consider, of course, is the size of files. If you're working with a lot of images, if you're working with a lot of PowerPoint presentations, you're going to need access to storage and upload and download speeds that are not a drag on the system. Yeah, and I've often found that that's been one of the biggest sticking points is just the sheer size of some of the documents that we use, and trying to either, basically share them and upload and download them. So what kind of content management, this is super high level that we're going through this, but I'd be happy to go in any deeper to the degree that I can if there are any questions.
Melissa, Lisa Jensen from WPC Utah says, SharePoint is a nightmare, haha. Google Drive is so much easier to use. Yeah,
I was trying not to be too hypercritical of any one system, but I have found SharePoint to be much more challenging than Google Drive, just personally. So as a small business owner, I definitely would consider starting there. And then where I've found, right, is that the cost starts to hit is very quickly I'm filling up the storage capacity, and I'm having to basically pay for more and more storage capacity, and that's where they get you. So your challenge as a budget manager is to take down the stuff you're not using, right? Get organized with your files so that you can put away the stuff that you like when it's old or it's archived, put it somewhere else so that you don't have to keep paying for the upgraded gigabytes and terabytes to store all that stuff. But it's interesting, they just chip away at you for, $9.99 a month. That's how they make their money, and it works. So you'll be able to take this. I'm happy to share this document, and you guys can go look up all of these different tools on your own and see if you can find something that'll work best for you. That the question as to about who needs what is clearly very, very specific and dependent upon your business type, your business size, the product that you deliver. I've obviously talked about like a service business, retail, that's yoga. I've talked about a service business in consulting, which is effectively the SaaS business of AtlasRTX, which we do both deliver a product and consult to clients. But you might have an actual product that you're delivering, which might need workflows. You might have something that is, I mentioned this a second ago, image heavy, where you've got lots of things that you need to display and demonstrate and show visually, which is going to push you right into the needs for higher levels of storage for all of that content, and you want it there so that you can easily access it. And then, of course, the question of your delivery methods and the way your teams work together, that if you're highly collaboration dependent, which is the case in one of my companies at Atlas, where we really have to work closely together. So we've started treating teams, for example, as like a drop-in, how you used to just stop by your colleague's office and poke your head in and say, hey, what about this? Now I do the same, and you would be less likely to do so with a phone call, right? But now we use Microsoft Teams where you just click the video, and I'm just randomly calling people all the time as if I were dropping into their room, their office, right? And by their desk to say, hey, what do you think about this? And that change in perception about how to use the tools is kind of that fundamental shift that we're seeing in teams, right? So if you're highly collaboration dependent, you're going to want the ability and the requirement that everybody get engaged and get on board and use it and has the permission. You know, and actually this is an important point that I didn't put out here that I think is really worth kind of wrapping up with. You want to help lay the groundwork for how your team is going to use these tools. So what I've found, as many of you probably have, is that because we know that everybody's home, the presumption is you'll be available at any time. And now suddenly you're working not 9 to 5, but 8 to 6, and maybe 7 and 8 p.m. at night, right? Because where else are you going to go? So, and why aren't you answering? Because I know you're there, right? So that issue has led to a structure in my business where we are very clear. This is how we're going to use Teams. Yes, we permit people to drop in and say hello and ask quick questions via video. Yes, we permit texting and so forth. And, you know, and then here are the restrictions. We don't, we have like break windows. Like we have a mandatory break from 12:30 to 1 every day inside the company. Nobody's allowed to text anybody or ask anybody anything. And it's just your break time. You certainly don't have to respond. You know, and or after hours or before hours, right? Small companies, we tend to bleed the lines in those after hours and before hours times. And if your team is really clear that that's how you work, great. If you wish to, you know, the more you can be clear about the boundaries and where their time is valued and respected, that's amazing and should be done, in my opinion. So who needs what? It's going to depend on your business, and maybe that's where it best gets left for any Q&A. Like, tell me a bit about your businesses and where are you running into questions and challenges, and if I can, I'll offer any thoughts and suggestions.
So there's a few questions that came up, Melissa. So I have one from Spencer Douglas at Staley West. He says, which programs does Melissa use with Atlas?
Yeah, so we're using Teams and Zoom. So Teams is really our internal communication tool. As we've been sitting here, some notes have been pinging up on my screen. I, you know, reply to this, reply to that. We use Zoom for client meetings. And as I mentioned, actually, and I run a weekly webinar for the company where I host guests, and we use the Zoom webinar feature for that. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I think it was last week, we were hosting our standard Thursday 10:30 a.m. Zoom, and it was just webinar. Nobody could hear anybody. It was choppy. Nobody could hear anything. We had to cancel it and move it to another date, which was, you know, doesn't happen a lot. It just happens enough that it's something to think about, right? So much so that Atlas is not considering moving, but I'm definitely considering moving to a different provider for the yoga studio. Teams is our internal one. We use SharePoint, which has a lot of clear permissions set up in it. As we've mentioned already, I'm not a huge fan of the ease of use. It's not quite as flexible as Google Drive, but it works and it does its job, and it's connected to Microsoft, which is, it's part of the package, right? I would say the other thing that I find with all of that is, even though you can create documents and manage and actually create them online, like in SharePoint, you can create a shared Word document, which is not the same as working out of the Word client on your desktop or laptop. And what happens is you have reduced functionality, and it can be a little herky-jerky, right? So I have a tendency to want to download things, work them, and upload them, which is time consuming. So I think this is one area where we all have to kind of consider what's best for our business.
Thank you for that. I did have another question come through, and this is going back to that like communication plan with Teams about how the expectation is like 8 to 6 now and things like that. Ruben asks, how do you manage that communication plan? What is your expectation in response to an email? What about a text? How do you set that up for your teams?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, it's interesting in the world. So my boss at Atlas has a belief that the text connections are actually the most personal connections you can have now. Like it used to be, you know, you had someone's personal email address, so now you have a personal connection with them via email. But because nobody reads their email and people don't respond to email the way they used to, that text is really the way to get personal. And so we, as a result, as a company, as the head of sales, one of the things I am constantly working to do is set up text communication with my prospective clients. And I often do it in a way to say, and I'll get to the team management question in a moment, but I think this is interesting. And I often set it up in a way to say, hey, I'm just opening this channel for you. Like if you'd like to respond here, you're welcome to text me. And it's a way of kind of being, look, I'm being vulnerable with you, right? And in many ways, we pull that back into the team management as well. So what's interesting for us is that we are pretty good about shutting down at the end of the day. AtlasRTX is actually very specific that we actually do work 8 to 6. That was how the company was set up. So any of you who want a job and want to work extra hours, we're going to need more people soon who come join us. And it is 8 to 6. They were very, very explicit about that when I was hired. But does it bleed over that time? No, it does not. And we're very clear about that. And we are very clear about breaks in the middle. Now, I have the text channel to reach my team, but I find that I don't need it for the most part. I'm able to connect on Microsoft Teams with them, and it, you know, because it downloads or it's because there's an app on your phone, it'll ping people. And I generally do not expect, and I have said this to my team numerous times, I do not expect you to reply after hours. And so for us, after 6, because I think it's not right to infringe on what is already very, very busy time for all of us. So get very clear, be a cool boss, make sure you don't, you know. Oh, my other favorite feature, by the way, in email these days, if you haven't already discovered it, is the timed send on email communications, right? So you can draft an email and schedule it to send at a later time. I tend to do late night work or early morning work, and then, I used to just send those emails because I didn't want it to sit and I'd forget about it, right? So you'd have to send them. Now you can send them and schedule them to go at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. or a reasonable hour instead of 4 a.m. when you had insomnia and you were working on something.
Thank you for that. For the sake of time, Scott Leavitt has a question, so I'll just ask you to answer that shortly, and then we'll wrap things up. He says he's curious about what naming conventions you use in your Google Drive.
Yeah, naming conventions are so important to me. It has to be, you know, you can go now. You can have document names that are forever long. And that's just annoying because you can't actually see what it is when it pops up in the abbreviated version of the window. I'm very strict about marking, obviously, a title that is preferably an abbreviated title, but one that then tells you what version it is and what date it was created. And so for me, version control and date are critical, and I require that of my team as they produce content that we use. So I try to get them to truncate names to something that's specific. And then when you have an effective file folder structure, right, you don't necessarily have to repeat the full length of it's the this for the this for the this for the this. No, it's just that subset in that folder. And as long as things are kept the way they should be, and they have dates and times and versions on them, that's my best advice on managing that.
That's excellent. That's actually a really smart way to set things up. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, Melissa, for presenting. I know I learned a lot. It was a fantastic interaction there. I want to remind everyone of our next session next Thursday, on Thursday with Tania Wallace, and she will be talking about time management, which I think will be super important. I will be sending out an email reminder coming up, and then I will also be sending out, with that email reminder, we do have a date and time scheduled for that bonus session with Dean Mary Pearson. So looking forward to seeing everybody on Thursday. Have a great day, and thank you again, Melissa.
Yeah, Madeline, do you want my slides to send out? Because I think I made some updates since I sent them to you before. Do people want them, or do they?
Why don't we send them out? I think I see some thumbs up in the group. Let's send them out so people can see them. Thank you for that.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure to talk. I hope it was useful, and best of luck to all of you. Happy to answer any other questions if anyone has any.